I have worked in different parts of the country. The idea for the research question for this doctoral work, however, got planted in my mind in 2019 when I began working as the National Lead Consultant on Women, Peace and Security in Sri Lanka, entrusted with drafting a national action plan on women, peace and security. During this process, I had the opportunity of visiting 25 districts. There are 25 districts in Sri Lanka within 9 provinces. And all over the country, we conducted consultations, individual interviews, and organized focus groups with victims of conflict and with state officers and members of civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, religious leaders, and pretty much everybody who is considered as a stakeholder in the armed conflict or people who were affected by the armed conflict. Something that struck me during this work is that the women victims that we were talking to were explaining their lived realities to us, and all of them seems to have something in common. So I mentioned that all of this relates to the armed conflict. What happened was, at the end of the armed conflict, Sri Lanka began introducing new laws and mechanisms, of course, with the push of international law and the quote-unquote international community and the United Nations organization. So these new laws and mechanisms is what we know as transitional justice. So this included setting up commissions of inquiry to look for disappeared persons, and they conducted some trials on conflict-related sexual violence, established new laws and offices on missing persons and reparations, and there were also discourses even now on the possibility of establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and other justice mechanisms. But what was illuminating for me during the policy work I was doing was that the women that I was speaking to were unconvinced of the transitional justice process. They spoke of impacts of ethnicity, patriarchy, and conflict-related violence. But why exactly they were unconvinced of transitional justice was not a question that I could investigate into during a policy-making process that was heavily controlled by the state in each step. This is why I thought of exploring this intriguing question through doctoral research. What you see on the screen now is something that one of my research participants said during the interviews. This is an idea that was more or less reiterated by all of my research participants and also by the women victims that I talked to during the policymaking process. So this brings us to my research questions. The question I ask, therefore, is this: how can the case study of Sri Lanka relating to women living within ethnicized patriarchal contexts who have experienced violence during armed conflicts help us understand justice in transition more generally? Throughout this, I will be employing several sub-research questions that explore the background of transitional justice and the context of Sri Lanka, both with regard to ethnicity and with regard to gender, and then I will move on to an exposition of how Sri Lanka's post-colonial and post-war context leading up to the transitional justice process reveals gaps with regard to the idea of justice in transition. Against this, I ask, in what ways do Sri Lankan women perceive their positionality in relation to ethnicity, extant ideas of justice, and current attempts at gendering the transitional justice process? And I will be making an attempt to explore practical and conceptual barriers to making meaning of justice in transition. So I intend to begin my analysis with an evaluation of the general context of transitional justice at present to explore how we have got to where we are in transitional justice law in general. If you look at the work of Ruti Tittle, Paige Arthur, Hakim Yusuf, transitional justice's mainstream literature claims to be a global justice system that states turn to when domestic mechanisms fail to address widespread past harms. It reveals that transitional law derives from and responds to the political implications of repression as state policy. According to Tittle, transitional justice responds to persecution perpetrated on the basis of race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, or ideology. According to Paige Arthur, ethnicity was a politically salient factor even in post-communist states, which typically had more egalitarian societies. Therefore, there is a clear recognition in transitional justice literature that ethnicity is a significant factor of societal fragmentation. It can therefore be argued that this factor should be considered in forming what Tittel has called a theory of transitional justice. In more recent literature of transitional justice, the focus on ethnicity has become much stronger. While obviously nationality, religion, class are also social demographic factors that are explored in transitional justice and should be further researched on, in my thesis, I focus on ethnicity for two reasons. First, literature and the praxis of transitional justice identify ethnicity as a cause of conflict in most states where transitional justice has been necessitated, especially in the recent past, when domestic laws, codes, and institutions fail to address widespread, large-scale human rights violations perpetrators and undemocratic regimes commit during wars and other conflicts. Such ethnic dimensions of conflicts are observable in a number of states, such as Gambia, Guatemala, Iraq, Kenya, Peru, Rwanda, Sri Lanka, Sudan, and many others. There are ongoing transitional justice processes in the countries that I just mentioned to you. Second, apart from engaging with ethnicity as a cause of conflict in these contexts, transitional justice literature has not yet explored from a legal perspective how and whether ethnicity influences the conceptualization of justice in transition from what we see in transitional justice law as embedded within international law. Filling this gap matters to transitional justice scholarship is important for two reasons. First relates to transitional justice's claim of being a global norm. Even though Tittel claims that transitional justice rejects the notion and moves towards a more liberal democratic political system, which implies a universal and ideal norm, mainstream literature, including Tittel's own work, suggests that transitional justice makes claims of being a global norm. This raises several questions because transitional justice scholarship does not explain the grounds on which transitional justice law becomes global. Therefore, it is unclear if it is global because of its international law roots. If yes, this automatically becomes a problematic assumption, particularly for the global South, because international law has been shown to be Eurocentric by many scholars such as Anthony Angie, B.S. Chimney, T.S. Garthi, Rose Parfit, Sandhya Pahuja, Ratna Kapoor, Vasuki Nesaya, and many, many others. We also know through the works of third world approaches to international law that mainstream international law reflects and constitutes imperial structures and practices. Moreover, to adapt from Vasuki Nesaya's deliberations on international law histories, international law uses crisis situations, such as those relating to transition, in the production of legitimacy for international law, while concealing crisis of international law and its role of producing crisis. Yet, mainstream transitional justice literature continues to promote its global claim by introducing transitional justice to states externally while disregarding the crisis it creates internally, which is the lack of justice for the people who are looking for justice within those states. To borrow from Parfit, this creates a standard of civilization through international law that can undergird and extend the European colonial project within international law. These instances show that transitional justice's main claim of being a global norm is contestable. This opens a debate on whether justice in transition ought to be reconceptualized, and if so, such a reconceptualization must draw from the ideas of justice from all parts of the world. However, at present, as has been shown by Anja Mir, there is a lack of global comparative multi-level studies on transitional justice measures. Of course, there is a recent book that came on Timor-Leste that fills this gap with regard to Timor-Leste. But of course, what I'm suggesting is that it needs to be done at more granular levels in different countries where transitional processes are ongoing. Until such studies are undertaken, transitional justice cannot function on the assumption that the extant, indeterminate idea of justice is a global concept which can readily be applied all over the world. To do so would be to commit what Rose Parfitt calls historical violence on the receiving end of discipline. Second, transitional justice scholars should be interested in this historical violence of globalizing this view as it results in knowledge gaps and epistemic violence. One such epistemic gap, as I've shown, relates to the significant role that ethnicity plays in many contemporary conflicts. What I argue is that an understanding of ethnicity's impact on justice may shed light on how and whether ethnicity has a bearing on people's expectation of justice and therefore on the meaning of justice in transition. Disregarding this could perpetuate epistemic violence, resulting in the idea of justice being insufficiently understood and hence wrongly implemented through transitional justice. This could lead to perpetuation of systemic injustices and, of course, lead to people who are looking for justice to be left without justice in transition. It is against this gap in literature that I moved to explore these issues using the case study of Sri Lanka. So why Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka was not only under a conflict for a long period of time, it was also under colonial rule from 1505 to 1948. First, the Portuguese altered the socio-demographic fabric of Sri Lanka. Then the Dutch brought their Roman Dutch laws and along with it some patriarchal traditions that have now been embedded in the legal system of Sri Lanka. Then came the British colonial powers from 1815 to 1948. They not only altered the existing legal system of Sri Lanka, but also employed what is generally called the divide and rule policy. This was not only done socially, but also legally. This left irreparable rifts between the different communities, which manifested into discriminations through the laws once the majoritarian community of Sri Lanka, that's the Sinhalese, took over power of governance from the British rulers after independence was granted to Sri Lanka in 1948. Many laws that were adopted in the immediate post-colonial period of Sri Lanka were targeted at disenfranchising the Tamils, who I said earlier were the second ethnic group or the largest numerical minority in Sri Lanka. So the Sinhalese politicians portrayed that the Tamil community had benefited from colonial rule. What matters here is not whether the Tamil community actually was privileged during the colonial period. Rather, what matters is that the real or perceived notions about colonial rule manifested in discriminatory majoritarian laws that were used in persecuting against the Tamil community. Ethnic divisions that became so entrenched from the time of independence, that is 1948, evolved into irreparable ethnic cleavages until 1983, at which point an anti-Tamil pogrom, which some scholars say was created by the government of Sri Lanka and supported by the state, resulted in the deaths, torture, and displacement of thousands of the Tamil ethnic group. By this time, in the north of Sri Lanka, which was predominantly considered to be the homeland of Tamils, a Tamil armed movement had grown, which was becoming the LTTE earlier. What you see in dark blue on the map was the area that was an active battlefield for much of this time from 1983 to 2009, and we still find a lot of people in these areas who remain without justice for various reasons. And what you see on the next slide are the statistics relevant to the main ethnic communities of Sri Lanka, which also includes the Muslim community. That's the second largest numerical minority in Sri Lanka. By 1990, the Muslim community also began getting impacted by the armed conflict. They were mainly based in the east of Sri Lanka, and the Muslims in this region were Tamil speaking, just like the Tamil ethnic community. As a result, the LTTE tried to assimilate the Muslim community within their group as Tamil-speaking peoples. When this was not working because of the existing cultural and religious distinctions between the Tamil and Muslim ethnic groups, the hardening of the cleavages led to an almost overnight eviction of thousands of Muslims from the eastern province, and they became displaced in 1990. And I've talked to some of these women during my research. It is in this broader context that gender comes into the picture. During this war with Sinhalese, Tamils, and the Muslims, women had several roles. In the LTT, some women were combatants. On the side of the state armed forces, there were women who have sacrificed their husbands and sons to the war, and they were considered as war heroes and war widows. And on the Muslim community side, there were many women who were displaced. And while all of this was ongoing, the government was also ignoring the fact that there were many women in the South looking for justice for something that has happened simultaneously with the armed conflict, which is a Marxist youth insurrection that has taken place between 87 to 89. So at this time, there were disappearances and extrajudicial executions. Against this collective, and after the war, the government introduced transitional justice, which I told earlier were unconvincing to people. So these women that I spoke to were unconvinced with court processes, critical of the police, which had no regard for women, suspicious of the capacity of law's idea of justice, and were absolutely skeptical of the newly introduced transitional justice processes' capacity to redress the harms that have been ongoing for decades. Secondly, despite the disillusionments, these women were believing in the idea of justice through transition. They weren't rejecting transitional justice. They were just rejecting the current manifestation of transitional justice because they couldn't get the kind of justice that they were looking for. So I interviewed 21 women within various different provinces, and I tried to capture all three communities in equal measure. And there were a range of women who had undergone various different experiences with the war, like they were war widows, ex-combatants, military widows, single parents, mothers who have lost sons to disappearances, conflict-related disabilities, conflict-related sexual violence, so on and so forth. So what I'm doing right now is coding the data that I'm at currently. Against this background, I have formed a theoretical framework to explore my research question, that is to understand what justice means in transition. To do so, I triangulate the relationship between ethnicity, gender, and transitional justice, given that these commonalities can be seen in many countries which are currently attempting to employ transitional justice, especially from the perspective of women who are falling through the cracks of the transitional justice system, irrespective of what gendered systems we have developed into international law, including the UN Resolution 1325, which looks specifically at women, peace, and security, and also have a host of other resolutions that have tried to look at it. Despite these mechanisms, these women are falling within the cracks of justice within their domestic spheres. So this is what I am trying to explore through my research, and to connect what I've said so far to the background that have laid. I present this diagram where I'm looking at ethnicity and justice and gender, and ask what patriarchal approaches have been doing to this, and ask how best to make justice work against a background that is influenced also by international law and the patriarchy embedded in ethnicity. So although it may be amply clear through my detailed presentation what my methodological approaches are, I also want to reiterate that my methodological approaches in this thesis are to work through the case study method, where I focus on Sri Lanka. And then I have begun my exploration through guided semi-structured interviews. I wanted the women to be free in what they say, so that I find out new things and not just confine myself to what I think I know or what I found through the research already, so that there is a narrative that I build from the ground up rather than working from a top-down kind of approach. And looking at it from the perspective of post-colonial feminist lens, because Sri Lanka is a post-colonial.
Sorry for coming in. You have 2 minutes left, please. Okay.
And and I will be looking at analyzing this data from this post-colonial perspective so that I could produce something about the global South women as knowledge producers who can contribute to filling an epistemic gap that is presently present in transitional justice literature. So far, what I have developed as the argument of thesis based on the fieldwork and other research is that mainstream positions of justice in transition have subjugated, consciously or unconsciously, knowledges of justice extant at the grassroots levels of the non-Western society, particularly of women. These realities are constructed and viewed through one's positionality or social location. What I have thought now is that these women may produce multiple truths regarding what is intellectually knowable about justice in transition, which is material for knowledge production, as the lack of emphasis on these has so far caused an epistemic violence in transitional justice literature and praxis. Of course, I need to examine this in greater depth in the data I uncovered in the field. This is where I'm currently at, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and constructive feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the beautiful paper, Danushka. Thank you so much. Especially when you started talking about Twill, I became quite interested because that's also my area of interest. Thank you very much for that engaging paper. At this time, I would like to invite the discussant for this, and that's Dr. Tom Frost. He's a senior lecturer in law at University of Kent. You've got 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And
Danushka, can you stop sharing the slide so that we can clearly see Tom?
1 second. How to okay, found it.
Here you go, Tom. Over to you.
Yes, please go ahead. Thank you. We can't hear you. I think you're still,
try that.
Yeah.
There we go. I've got about 5 buttons in front of me and I always pick the wrong one. Thank you very much, Danushka. That was a really fascinating paper. I think it's a very interesting approach to transitional justice. Certainly take into account Twail and critiques of international law as well. So these may be in no particular order. But and forgive me if I've understood what you were saying. So first thing is that you were talking about this idea of, or one of the things you were talking about was colonial favoritism, and especially perceived colonial favoritism in Sri Lanka towards the Tamil community. And that seemed like a very interesting point. So I was just wondering more generally if you could briefly explain what that involved in practice. Because to me at least that's quite a common occurrence. I suppose kind of the most well-known example of that would be Rwanda in terms of Belgian rule there. And you looked at how Sri Lanka helps us to understand transitional justice. It's maybe a bit of an unfair question when you're 2 years in. But in terms, maybe you can think about where you want to go or what your ultimate answer could be. But I suppose the question that would come to mind is how does Sri Lanka, or how does the study you're looking at help us to understand transitional justice around the world in other jurisdictions, right? So what is it about Sri Lanka that you could think of as maybe unique to the Sri Lankan situation? But what is it about your study and the women that you're interviewing that can start transferring this kind of knowledge to other locations? I think as well in terms of transitional justice as a global norm, absolutely. I mean, Ruti Title's work that you cited there, but I think that is we're now talking about something that is decades old. And we're now living in an age of growing populist rule around the world, a growing populist parties, that kind of dream of post-Cold War, transitional justice to a better world seems to be in many places receding. So I think if you have any thoughts, I wouldn't mind hearing about what you see the future, if there is a future for transitional justice, or whether the state of the world as it is means we need to start letting go of that idea, building on it, changing it, moving it forward. And I think on the final point, I don't want to overrun because I know there's plenty of people here, but the final point in terms of this is you mentioned about the European influence in Sri Lanka, and you mentioned about the kind of imposition of certain patriarchal ideals. I think you mentioned that was by the Dutch, right, in the kind of Romano Dutch law that was introduced. So would you be able to give a couple of examples of that, and possibly how that has impacted some of the women that you've interviewed? Am I okay to leave it for there, rather than just bombarding you with questions?
Okay, that's fine. Would you like to respond?
Yeah,
or would you want him to continue? Okay.
Very interesting questions. Thank you, Dr. Frost. I obviously need to think about some of them in obvious great depth and detail, but to give you like a few quick responses to the first question you asked about colonial favoritism in Sri Lanka, and you asked me whether I could briefly explain what that was. So during the time of the British, the first level of control were in the coastal areas, and from the map that you saw, you also saw that 2/3 of the country was under the armed conflict, and that was the area which was primarily governed by the colonial rulers as well. And that originally meant that there were missionary schools, exposure to English language, and therefore exposure to more opportunities in governance, public sector employment, so on and so forth. So that was mostly to the Tamils. I don't necessarily think it was an ethnic thing as such. I have read about that history, but I think it was also the geographical presentation of the country as such, because in the geographical area there were more Tamils in the coastal areas. But of course, this was portrayed as something that was being done to help the Tamils come up and take benefits from the colonial rulers. It's a bit counterintuitive, I think, to think like that, but that's the majoritarian political narrative. The reason why I say it's counterintuitive to think like that is because Sri Lanka also had a Tamil king. The last king of Sri Lanka was a Tamil king that was ousted by the British rulers. And even in the independence struggles, there were lots of Tamil members who were prominent. But this was the Sinhala majoritarian narrative, and to sort of get rid of the Tamils who have come into higher places intellectually or academically and become involved in public sector employment, the Sinhala majoritarian government brought policies, standardization, university policies towards 1971 that led to sort of giving a lesser mark to Sinhala candidates as a qualifying mark. And the Tamil candidates had to get a higher mark to enter universities, for instance. So that's one of the manifestations that also added on to the conflict. And you asked, well, where do I want to go with transitional justice by looking at Sri Lanka, and what would it help us say about other locations? So what I'm thinking is the kind of ethnic cleavages that we see in Sri Lanka and the impacts that it has on gender, for instance, I think we also notice it in other post-colonial countries that are struggling with transitional justice. So I haven't really gotten to that point yet, but I'm wondering if it would be possible to not only stop this at the Sri Lanka level, but also to sort of have some common general things like guidelines for us to use in looking at transitional justice in other countries which have been under colonial rule and also have women falling through the cracks of transitional justice, so to speak. Thirdly, you asked me, what do I think of the populist rule, populist dream of post-Cold War TJ, whether it's going away and whether there is a future for transitional justice and whether we must start building on it or moving on from it. I think scholarly literature has already started moving on it for a little bit, because we also see transformative justice coming up as against transitional justice. I've also written about it in one piece that we did with the Gender Justice Hub at LSE. But I think one of the things that the academics or the civil society that is working on transformative justice doesn't necessarily see is that at the legal level, within countries, at the implementation level or at the policy level, we are still at transitional justice. The legal systems haven't really moved on to transformative justice. There are no laws, at least in the case of Sri Lanka, on transformative justice. People barely know about transitional justice when I talk to them. Some don't understand even the words. Now, the interviews I conducted, they were in Sinhala and Tamil. Even the words that they use for transitional justice in Sinhala and Tamil, people can't understand because the words sound like technical terms that nobody uses in day-to-day language. And when you say, oh, this is the office that was established under transitional justice, they know. And they know that they can't access it because there is so much bureaucracy, there is so much misogyny within those institutions. So yes, academically, I think there is building on it, moving on from it, but legally, I think we are stuck at transitional justice within the law. And that also we haven't done properly, which is why people are so skeptical about whether transitional justice can do. But if you ask me about whether it has a future, I think it does, because everybody, every woman that I spoke to, so I don't know what it would really mean in terms of theorization of this data. I don't know that yet because I haven't looked at it. But what they told me was, it's not that they don't want transitional justice. They want justice. But they don't think that transitional justice can work because they think that transitional justice also works within the same barriers that justice in law generally works, like bureaucracy, like corrupted politicians, like politicians doing it for their benefits. There were so many participants who used the exact phrase. I was so surprised. There were many who said it's a tick box exercise. I didn't prompt them to say it. I was like, what do you think about transitional justice? They were like, oh, it's a tick box exercise. I'm sure politicians got money from it. So it was unprompted, and it was very surprising for me to hear that many of my, I think 8 of the 21 participants used that exact same phrase. It was very surprising. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That's quite interesting. That's quite interesting. It seems Tom still had something to say, but before that, I don't know, does anyone, any participants, any questions so far? Would you like to make a comment? Any question from the participants? Otherwise, when Tom was talking, it seems he still needed a concluding remark or statement. Tom, do you still want to conclude on something? Otherwise, okay, I'm sorry, before going to Tom, yeah, I've got one question from Teladlech. Please, can you go ahead with your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Danushka, for a very insightful presentation. So I'm Dr. Khadija. I've got a PhD in gender and higher education, so it's quite a bit far from law. And sometimes, just to confirm with what some of your participants had said, sometimes we're alien to me. So since my background is in gender, I'm going to focus on asking questions about gender. So I've got one really important question in mind. In slide 11, you spoke about post-colonial theory and how it helped shape your theoretical framework. So my question is, so before that, I worked in my PhD on Algeria and the Algerian context of education. And it struck me when you were explaining the context of Sri Lanka that there are some similarities despite the geographical distance between Algeria and Sri Lanka concerning the colonial history, the inherited patriarchal systems, the civil war that happened in Algeria between 1990 and early 2000s, and how women also suffered the aftermath of the civil war. So my question is related to your theoretical framework, specifically the gender bit of it. So you spoke about post-colonial theory and your explanation of it, that women are producers as well in social structures. So the element of agency in your research female agency or feminist agency amongst the women who took part in your study in their, I can't remember, I've done interviews, yeah? Yeah. So in your interviews, have you sensed an element of agency? Has the element of agency emerged in your data as an important part of how these women navigated their experiences? And did that resonate with what you've seen in the literature concerning the colonial history, concerning the Civil War, concerning modernity and social media, for example? So how the element of a female agency work in your research in relation to the other two bits of your theoretical framework, social justice and ethnicity?
Thank you very much, Khadija. So, Danushka, would you like to answer? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That's a point that I need to think about a lot. And thank you for pointing out that there are similarities between Algeria and Sri Lanka. I want to be looking at that as well. In terms of the elements of agency, yes, I did notice. So I think for now, from the data, what I can say is that I have seen it from two perspectives. One is that they think that there are structural injustices that have worked to remove their agency. So they were very critical of that. They were critical about how, when they went to police stations, how they were treated, how police were asking for sexual bribes when they were looking for their disappeared loved ones, and how they were suggesting that they come at other times without chaperones, for instance. They also, I would say 3 points actually. They also spoke about agency from the perspective of ethnicity, in that they were talking about how laws surrounding their ethnic groups were working to subjugate them and disempower them. I think this also connects to something that Dr. Frost asked about, like what the colonial rulers did. It was, in the Sri Lankan case, it was not only Roman Dutch, but it was also the British that also brought in some gendered laws that undermined the women. For instance, there was a law called Tesavalame law. There is a law called Tesavalame law that impacts the Tamil women. And most of these Tamil women whose husbands have been disappeared can't even get their property anymore, because the Tesavalame law that was codified under the colonial rule gives the power to the man to own the property. So now that the husbands are missing, there are no signatures, there is no way to find these documents, and the women are without land rights. So there is that issue. And in the Sinhala community, there was a law codified called Kandyan law, which is only one region of Sri Lanka. But now, the law was applicable to all Sinhalese women before the colonial rulers, but now it's only applicable to a little group of women in one region.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the response. Okay.
One point about it.
Just
and these women.
1 second. We can't hear you anymore.
No,
okay.
I stopped speaking.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Please.
No, actually, Danushka, go ahead. Complete your point.
Yeah. So the law, the indigenous law actually had more power to the women. They had more agency. So some of them did talk about it. And then Dr. Khadija asked me whether it resonates with elements of agency that I have read in post-colonial literature. Yes, because these women were saying that if they had the power, this is how they will ask for justice. So there were points of agency where they were talking about structural injustices and how they would talk about justice if they had the power. That kind of agency I've seen.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you. So please, let's quickly go to the pair commentator, Bernardo. He's specializing in international human rights and at the University of Newcastle. Please, you have 5 minutes for this.
Thank you, and I wanted to thank Dr. Nauman and everyone, the organizers. It's a pleasure to be here, part of the Global South Network, and I'm also, as Danushka, I'm beginning this journey here. I don't have questions per se, but more comments. But one question I think Dr. Ton also touched upon is does your research have a normative output? And commenting on that would be, and I do have to say the presentation and the research seems very structured and very profound. Congratulations. My worry with that would, because you're tackling so much, if you try to do a normative approach at the end, it will be too much. That is a concern that I have. Obviously, that is something that you can do for further research. Try to compare it with other experiences in other countries. But I think for the time and the scope of your research, it would be more productive to keep on that. The other comment would be, and I don't know if you're already doing this because I know you had a short time, but one of my concerns in terms of decolonizing approaches is the academia slash praxis divide. So my question slash comment would be, do you use, are you planning on bringing the results of our research back to the community, back to those women you interviewed, for them to see if, first of all, if what you found, it's really what they think? Because obviously, and I think Kalesha also mentioned this, we use legalese, we use legal language, so I would be worried about how that would translate. So I don't know if you can, again, with the time frame, but if you can go back and talk to them and show, okay, this is what I understand as common points or conclusions that I can draw from what you said. Do you agree with this? And then present them the final work and okay, this is what I see as a big picture. I just think that is a very important view in terms of decolonizing the research itself. But other than that, and I don't know if you're using this, I would suggest the Kaupapa Maori research framework. Linda to Highway Smith, she has a very interactive approach with her interviews. A suggestion, but other than that, I mean, great research, really profound, and I can see that you did a lot of work. So that's those are my comments.
Thank you very much, Bernardo. Thank you so much. I think that was quite, I'm sure you'll find that quite useful, and that will help to really narrow, where you're heading to. So would you want to make a comment, or do we go straight to ask more questions?
Yes. So thank you very much, Bernardo. That was very useful. And this is a struggle that I have been having. So in the thesis, I am not going to adopt a comparative perspective because of the struggles that you are talking about. So I'm going to leave it at the case study and then sort of go into an argument as to whether it is a possibility to approach things of the issues of the other countries through an approach where there is a triangulated relationship between ethnicity and gender and transitional justice. So for my work, I'm going to limit it to ethnicity, gender, and transitional justice from the perspective of Sri Lanka. In that, I'm also removing other issues that I've seen in Sri Lanka, like caste. I didn't even think that it was such a big issue until I went to the field. I knew it was an issue, but I didn't think that it was also an issue with regard to transitional justice. But I'm not even going to touch upon that during my thesis, because it is definitely way too much, more than I can handle in a doctoral thesis. And you also asked about decolonizing approaches, and thank you very much for asking that. And that has been one of the main concerns with which I went, because I've not only been an academically oriented person. As I mentioned, I worked on policy. So one of the ideas that I suggested to Kent Law School when I was coming in was that there needs to be something done for these people as well. So to sort of tell the women that I interviewed what came out of this, I will be making a shorter document, like 2-3 pages, highlighting what I learned from them and what I want to do with it. And obviously the idea will be to, after the PhD, not within the PhD, of course, to try and make policy documents, as I've done in the past, to try and persuade the policymakers in Sri Lanka to do something about it. Of course, I'm skeptical now, like my interviewees, whether that is going to achieve anything, but I'm going to try and do it. Thank you very much, Bernardo.
Thank you so much, Danushka. We're almost out of time, but we can just take one short question and a brief answer, and that will be it. Thank you. Okay, Sonia, please. A short one, please.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really fascinating topic. I think, yeah, my question kind of overlaps with what it has already been said, but yeah, my research is more on the theoretical side, and I do see the concerns of trying to approach the task of kind of generating a what would be, or what I understand would be, as like a feminist perspective of transitional justice. It would be really a huge task to try to undertake if you want to really focus on the case studies. But I do think that from your field work, you can definitely use it as evidence to suggest the necessity of this kind of approach, of this kind of normative approach to transitional justice. And like, yeah, I would say, in addition to what has already been said about the maybe still relevance and importance of post-colonial theory, and maybe, yeah, a feminist perspective to transitional justice. I think because you have also mentioned and you are interested in the ethnicity issue, I think well, the idea of intersectionality would also be important, or will play a role in understanding how these two bases of conflict and discrimination really overlap. Yeah, so maybe on the other side of your quantitative methodology, I'm not an expert on that, but if I understood correctly, you did 20. So you interviewed 21 women. So from that perspective, I just wanted to ask if you think that is like a representative number to try to prove your point, or if you think that kind of a wider, okay, kind of a larger number of interviews would need to be made to really have a good sense of what is this skepticism among these women about how transitional justice has been implemented in Sri Lanka. Yeah, I think I can do that.
Thank you, Sonia. I think I will respond to the last point because it's the most important issue that I had as well. So since I'm looking at it from a qualitative standpoint, I'm not looking at my data as quantitative evidence to prove that there is skepticism or this is how they want transitional justice. Rather, what I'm using the 21 qualitative, very detailed, these interviews were 1 to 2 hours long. I'm using them as life histories and narratives that say something about transitional justice, because I wanted to avoid the issue of, quantitative challenges. And obviously I can't take on more interviews, although it would have been lovely. It's absolutely impossible to do more than that from a qualitative perspective during a PhD research, which has funding limitations, time limitations, and so on. But thank you also for talking about intersectionality. That is something that I really must look into in further depth. Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you so much, Danushka. I think that's a very interesting paper. We've really had good and engaging, time, and also see very beautiful comments here, especially on the one talking about you going to show the women, the research. I think that makes you not a politician like they would think. So that's a very good one. Thank you very much for that. And thank you to every participant. And I know, Tom, I don't know, you were trying to conclude something. Let me help you conclude. I know you are happy with the paper. So please, let's meet again next week, same time. I'll be having Mary Adeyomi, a PhD candidate at University of Oxford Law School, and she will be talking about Nurse Moyewa, the apprenticeship of nursing and midwifery in Nigeria, the gateway to unprecedented deaths, on the 25th of October, 2023 at 2 p.m. And if I could just ask a quick one, Dr. Is it the nurse? Is it like the Eliza nurse? I think I'll be looking out for that. Thank you very much, everyone, and do have a lovely evening. Bye. Okay, and then let me not forget, let's still thank the organizer and especially Dr. Nauman. He's really doing so much, and I'm sure we're really engaging ourselves and knowing so much about different researches. So thank you to Nauman and the Global South Network for bringing us together. Okay,
thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Danushka.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.